When I first wrote the religious education book in 1989, which was itself the result of some teaching that I was doing, religious education, it seemed to me, meant one thing, and that was passing on the faith. It was a confessional kind of a thing. It functioned pretty exclusively in religious schools. I believed that religion as part of education had a wider role to play, and so a lot of the courses that I ran, and ultimately the book, were all about, I suppose, distinguishing between different forms of religious education, and hence the name, what is this thing called RE, or religious education. And I distinguish in the book between what I called faith-forming religious education, en-faithing, if you like, confessional religious education, and on the other hand what I called interfaith religious education that was designed to enhance understanding of the wider world of religion, regardless of any kind of en-faithing agenda. And within each of those two different categories I distinguished further between, on the one hand, in faith forming, the difference between a very prescriptive, if you like, old-fashioned didactic approach to religious education, be it using things like the catechism, which tended to be a tradition in Catholic religious education, or using the Bible as the basis of a very didactic religious education, a bit more typical perhaps of some Protestant versions of religious education at the time. Either way, a prescriptive didactic approach, and then later developments like life-centred RE, something that developed in the 70s, which was much more about helping students to reflect on their life and the role of religion in it, etc., etc., but at the end of the day still looking to end faith. And then of course Thomas Groom's praxis approach to religious education, perhaps one of the most educationally oriented models of religious education, certainly devised to that point in time. But at the end of the day, still looking to confirm somebody, if you like, in a particular faith. And then under the interfaith religious education, further divisions of what I broadly call social scientific models, approaches, historical approaches, psychological approaches, sociological approaches. What role does religion play in history, in somebody's psyche, in the social cohesion of a group of people, etc., with absolutely no en-faithing agenda whatsoever. And then a further distinction looking at the phenomenological model, which it seemed to me had some kind of reflection of the praxis model, and indeed a little bit on the life-centred approach in the other category. Phenomenological being about taking in, soaking up, if you like, the phenomenon of religion, regardless of any sense of commitment or not. But interestingly did leave some room, it seemed to me, in the methodology of phenomenology for en-faithing to happen if one in fact wanted to move it that way. And then there was the typological model, which was also designed essentially for, I'd say, a public system of education, designed to examine the phenomena of religion in a fairly objective kind of a way, but even more so had an element in it that assumed a faith tradition as a background, and therefore left room for people to move back, perhaps more convinced or indeed more critical of that faith position. So I could see that while you had two different categories, faith forming and in faithing, that there was some margin for movement between the two. And that's how I developed the notion of the critical model as a way of blending those two, of presenting material in an objective way that didn't in any way crowd students' own psyche, that left psychological distance for them to feel as though they weren't being got at or having something, pushed down their throats. But at the same time, particularly in a religious school, where that should happen anyway, for the sake of good education, there would nonetheless be room for students to explore their own faith development, if you like, and indeed, if they wanted to, freely, to enhance their own faith. So blurring the boundaries between a very, very objective, clinical kind of an approach to religious education and one that at least left room for what we call faith development to occur, as long as always the freedom of the student to choose was respected. And in many ways, the way I see religious education having developed over the past 20 years or so, the ways in which in New South Wales the HSC Studies of Religion has developed as an HSC subject, the sorts of things I see happening in and around schools, be it public schools or religious schools, I see reflections of that compromise, if you like, that was captured in the notion of a critical approach to religious education. Always done well educationally. The same parameters that one would apply to any area of education are applied to religious education. It's not special in that sense, and students come to know it as a serious academic study, if you like, but at the same time leaving some room for their own development to happen, as indeed I would say should be happening in any education. I think education itself has moved a long way in its thinking in those 20 years, that good education in any subject, in any area, be it art or history or science or even mathematics, should be engaging the whole person somehow or other. And in that sense, while done well, objectively, at the same time is leaving room for personal reflection, personal development to occur. In that way, religious education can be seen as part and parcel of the mainstream of education, be it in a public school setting or a religious school setting.